Pupils non-reactive. No corneal reflex. Run it again. I already did. Time of assessment? 2:14. Cortical activity? Silence. Call the 7th review. Already done. Silence. Confirm it. Confirmed. 7 neurosurgeons. 7 independent reviews. 7 identical conclusions. No cortical activity. No response to pain. No spontaneous breathing. Byung-chul, clinically brain dead. He had a name that moved through certain rooms like a current nobody admitted to feeling. From Los Angeles to Busan, there were port warehouses and private clubs where men spoke of him in the present tense because the past tense was still too risky. He had built his network with the same precision a surgeon builds a field: layered, redundant, impenetrable. Byung-chul did not lose. He had never allowed the conditions for losing to exist. Being a ruptured cerebral aneurysm does not negotiate. When the vessel burst in his brainstem, it took oxygen in seconds. By the time paramedics reached him, the damage had likely already become the kind that does not reverse. The hospital he was brought to was the best in the city. The neurology wing was staffed by specialists who had spent their careers studying exactly this kind of catastrophic failure. It did not matter. Biology does not grant exceptions for empire. Outside the ICU, the city had no idea. But in other rooms, rooms without windows, with encrypted phones and men who did not sit, who only stood and paced and checked their screens, something was shifting. Port schedules that ran on his approval had gone unapproved for 9 hours. A transfer that required his authentication had stalled, and 3 separate networks were waiting on a word that was not coming. Nobody said what they were waiting for. Nobody needed to. An empire built on one man's authority does not idle well. It develops, in the absence of its center, a particular kind of held breath tension, the tension of something very large that has been asked, for the first time, to stay still. At 4:30, the hospital ethics board convened in a windowless room 2 floors below the ICU. The paperwork had already been prepared. 7 independent reviews, 2 apnea tests, 4 hours of EEG with a flatline trace. The documentation was thorough, the process legally sound, the conclusion unambiguous. Life support would be withdrawn within 48 hours. The attending physician would notify next of kin. The chaplain would be available. The process would be handled with care and with protocol. The form was signed. The clock began. In room 714, the ventilator continued its work. Rise, fall, mechanical, metronomic, indifferent. A machine breathing for a man the machines had already agreed was no longer there. The night shift at a hospital has its own geography. The fluorescent corridors, the squeaking wheels of a cleaning cart moving at the pace of someone paid by the hour, who has learned to be invisible in the specific way that certain rooms require. Ronki knew that geography, the way you know a route you have walked 1,000 times in the dark. She had been cleaning this hospital for 3 years, night shift. She knew which wards were quiet at 2 a.m. and which nurses called for extra towels. Once she knew which rooms to move through quickly and which ones to move through gently. She pushed her cart past the neurology wing without slowing. Tonight the babysitter had canceled. Abiola was strapped to her chest in a fleece blanket, 2 years old, barely 6 weeks past her last speech therapy appointment, half asleep and warm and humming to herself the way she did when she was almost but not quite gone. Hospital policy forbade it. Ronki was aware. But desperation doesn't stop to check policy manuals. It just moves forward and hopes the corridor stays empty. The ICU was dimmed after midnight. Ronki moved quickly. Rails disinfected, counters wiped, biohazard bins replaced. She reached the end of the corridor. 1 room left. The number on the door was printed in plain black on a plain white placard. She had cleaned this room 40 times. And she would clean it tonight and not think about the man inside it, because thinking about the man inside it was not her job. She pushed the door open with her cart. The ventilator hummed. Against her chest, Abiola stirred and began, in the soft, broken syllables of a child not yet fully awake, to hum. The monitors did not know who he was. They measured only what could be measured. pulse pressure, oxygen saturation, intracranial readings that had been stable for 6 hours in the way that things are stable when there is nothing left to destabilize. The machines worked with complete indifference. They did not know that the man they were attached to had once moved $200 million across 4 borders in a single quarter. They did not know his name carried weight in rooms the machines would never be brought into. They only knew what the numbers said, and the numbers said nothing. He had been born in Queens, a cramped apartment on the 4th floor of a building that smelled of other people's cooking and the particular dampness of windows that didn't seal. His mother had come from Busan with a suitcase and a cousin's address, and the specific determination of a woman who had decided, once, that the life behind her was finished. She cleaned offices, she worked nights. She learned English from television and from the people she cleaned for, absorbing vocabulary the way you absorb anything you need in order to survive. When the power went out, which it did in that building, with the reliable frequency of something nobody ever fixed, she sang. Not for comfort, not as performance. She sang because in the dark, with a small boy pressed against her side, it was the only thing that cost nothing and gave back more than it should. Byung-chul remembered the melodies better than he remembered her face in those years, a descending pattern, soft, repeating, something old, from somewhere she never named. He had not thought about it in decades. By 19, he understood that the legal economy was a system built for people who had already arrived. He was not those people. He learned quickly, and he learned from the men who operated in the spaces between legitimate structures, the ports, the import manifests, the private credit arrangements that existed in no official ledger. He was precise, he was patient. He suppressed everything that could be used against him, attachment, sentiment, any evidence that he could be moved. Fear, he learned, was more reliable than loyalty. Loyalty depended on the other person's character. Fear depended only on your own. He built accordingly. The aneurysm had been forming for years in a vessel in his brainstem, asymptomatic, invisible on no scan he had ever taken because he had never taken one. At 11:48 p.m., and now on a Thursday, it ruptured. He was in a private room. He was alone. The sequence was fast and merciless. Catastrophic hemorrhage, immediate loss of consciousness, oxygen cut to brainstem structures within seconds. By the time emergency teams reached him, the hypoxic window, the brief interval in which intervention can limit damage, had almost certainly closed. Surgery lasted 4 hours. Heavy sedation was required throughout and maintained afterward to manage intracranial pressure. The sedatives at the doses used were sufficient to suppress cortical activity to the point of mimicking full neurological shutdown. The neurosurgeons who reviewed him had followed protocol precisely. What they could not account for was the sedative load still metabolizing in his system, suppressing signals that might still exist beneath the silence. At 6:20, 2 members of the neurology team stood outside the room 714 with paper cups of cold coffee and the specific flatness in their voices of people who have had this conversation before. Organ viability window closes at 72 hours. Ethics board already signed. Family has been notified? Working on it. His contacts are complicated. A pause. The damage is irreversible. The word sat in the corridor. Nobody argued with it. Inside room 714, the ventilator kept its rhythm. Ronki had a nursing diploma. It was in a folder in the top drawer of the dresser in her bedroom, behind Abiola's birth certificate and a lease agreement she had renewed 3 times. She had earned it properly. With 4 years of study and 2 clinical placements and an examination, she had sat through a fever, because the rescheduling fee was not an option. In Nigeria, it meant something. In America, it meant she was permitted to apply for a credential assessment process that cost money she did not have, required documentation from institutions 12 time zones away, and offered no guarantee of outcome. She had started the process twice. Both times, something more urgent had overtaken it. The second time, something more urgent had a name. Abiola, born 7 weeks early, 4 pounds 11 ounces, placed in a NICU incubator, while Ronki sat in a plastic chair outside the glass and learned, in the span of a single night, a completely different definition of the word waiting. The speech therapy appointments were $180 each without insurance. The specialist had been cautiously optimistic, which was the version of optimism available in that particular situation. Abiola was improving. She was learning words the way she learned everything, unevenly, enthusiastically, and slightly ahead of the schedule everyone had set for her, based on what they assumed she could do. Tonight the babysitter had sent a message at 9:47 p.m., family emergency. So sorry. Ronki had read it standing in her kitchen, still in her coat, calculating the cost of missing a shift against the cost of not missing it. The math was not complicated. The math was never complicated. That was the particular exhaustion of her life. Not that the decisions were hard, but that they were so relentlessly, tediously clear. She had learned the lullaby from her grandmother. It was old, older than her grandmother could trace, a Yoruba melody built on descending notes and a phrase that repeated until the listener understood that repetition was the point. Her grandmother had sung it in a language she explained but never fully translated, because some things, she said, are not diminished by translation so much as lessened. Ronki had asked once what it meant. It means, you are still here, and that is enough, and it will continue to be enough. Keep going. She sang it to Abiola every night, not as ritual, as truth, because some nights that was the most honest thing she had. Keep going. Keep going. You are still here. At 10:23 p.m., she wrapped Abiola in the fleece blanket, the yellow one, the one that smelled of the fabric softener the baby had decided she preferred, and which Ronki now bought exclusively and without question. She settled the child against her chest. Abiola stirred, adjusted, went still. Ronki picked up her bag, picked up the cleaning cart keys from the hook by the door. She stepped out into the cold. The hospital entrance was 3 blocks away. She walked quickly, the way you walk when you are carrying something you are not supposed to be carrying, past the parking structure and the ambulance bay and the automatic doors that opened with a hiss of climate-controlled air. The security terminal beeped once as she swiped her badge. 10:31 p.m. Ronke was inside. Abiola was asleep, and neither of them, in any official record, was supposed to be there. The ICU at 11:50 p.m. was a different kind of quiet from the rest of the hospital. Not the quiet of emptiness, the quiet of things held very still by machines that did not stop. Monitors blinked in green and blue. The ventilator in room 714 completed its cycle every 4 seconds. The corridor light was dimmed to half and cast everything in the flat amber of a place that had agreed, without discussion, to suspend ordinary time. Ronki moved through it the way she always moved through it, efficiently, without looking at the beds for longer than necessary, because looking for longer than necessary was how you carried these rooms home with you. She had cleaned 7 rooms, 1 left. Abiola woke between one room and the next, not loudly, but in the ICU, not loud was still loud enough. The cry came in 2 short bursts, sharp, disoriented, the sound of a child surfacing from deep sleep into somewhere unfamiliar. Ronki pressed her palm flat against the baby's back and swayed, but Abiola's breath was already quickening toward something louder. She needed a room, empty. Somewhere the sound would not travel into the spaces where it could not be explained. Room 714 was right there. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The ventilator, the monitors, the man on the bed, still and geometrically arranged, the way only sedated patients are arranged, every limb in a position chosen by someone else. Ronki rocked Abiola gently. The baby's crying slowed. Then Abiola reached out, the imprecise, instinctive reach of a 2-year-old toward any surface within range, and her small palm came to rest on Byung-chul's forearm. The crying stopped. Silence. Not the silence of sleep. The silence of attention. Abiola tilted her head. Her eyes, still fogged with near sleep, moved toward his face. Then she leaned forward and rested her head lightly against the blanket over his chest, and she began to hum. In the neurological literature, auditory pathways are consistently identified as among the most resilient sensory systems in severe coma states. The brainstem, which governs basic auditory processing, can retain function, even when cortical activity has been profoundly suppressed. Melodic patterns with rhythmic regularity activate not only primary auditory cortex, but distributed limbic structures, including the amygdala and hippocampus, regions associated with emotional memory encoding. The brain does not store all memories equally. Music, particularly melody learned early and repeated with emotional context, is encoded in ways that persist beyond conscious access. Abiola hummed the lullaby, without knowing it was a lullaby. She hummed it the way she hummed everything she loved, incompletely, earnestly, in the broken pitch of a child who has learned rhythm before words. The descending notes filled the room, soft, repeating. The heart monitor flickered. Ronke assumed it was interference. ICU machines had sensitivities. She had seen monitors react to the cleaning solution before. Then the ventilator's rhythm shifted, a fractional variation, barely a second, but a variation. She stepped back. Her training, the training from 12 years ago that no American board recognized, made her look at the EEG readout on the wall panel. It was not flat. It was very nearly flat, but not flat. Her hand found the call button without her consciously deciding to press it. Nurse Hyun-young came in at a pace that was fast without being running. The specific velocity of someone who has learned to move urgently without alarming corridors. She checked the screen. She looked at Ronke. She looked at Abiola. She looked back at the screen. What happened in here? Ronke could not answer that question in any way that would make sense. The baby, she said. She was humming. Hyun-young was quiet for 4 seconds. Then she turned back to the EEG trace, still faintly active, still barely there, and said the 2 words that would bring Dr. Minho out of the on-call room at 12:03 a.m. Dr. Minho arrived at 12:03 a.m. with the particular expression of a man who has been called out of sleep by something he has already decided is explainable. He was a careful physician. He had been a careful physician for 19 years, and carefulness, in neurology, meant a very specific discipline. Do not let what you want to be true compete with what the evidence says. The evidence in this case had been thorough. 7 reviews, 2 apnea tests, an EEG trace that had shown nothing for 11 hours. He examined the readout Hyun-young showed him. He examined it without expression. Then he examined Byung-chol again. Penlight, pupils. Fixed, non-reactive. Corneal reflex. Absent. He ran the full assessment. It took 9 minutes. The results were consistent with every previous assessment. He was about to say so when Hyun-young said, "Do it while the baby is humming." Ronke, who had been standing near the door, trying to take up as little space as possible, looked at her daughter. Abiola was awake now, alert, interested in the lights on the ceiling monitor. Ronke held her close and softly, almost under her breath, began to hum the first bars of the lullaby. Abiola joined in immediately, the way she always did, the descending notes in her broken, earnest pitch. The EEG spiked. Not dramatically, a fractional elevation, but rhythmic, tracking the melodic pattern with a correspondence that was not random and not coincidental, and not something Dr. Minho could comfortably assign to machine interference. He looked at it for a long time. His brain death and minimally conscious state are diagnostically distinct, but can be difficult to differentiate when sedative agents remain active in the system. High-dose sedatives, particularly those used in emergency neurosurgical settings, suppress cortical electrical activity at levels that can present identically to full neurological cessation. The critical variable is washout time, the period required for sedative metabolites to clear sufficiently to allow accurate assessment. If testing occurs before washout is complete, suppressed activity may be misread as absent activity. He pulled up the medication log. The sedative doses administered during and after surgery had been clinically appropriate for the procedure. He ran the washout calculation himself twice on the bedside terminal. The numbers were uncomfortable, not wrong, but uncomfortable. The testing window had opened earlier than the full washout window would recommend under conservative protocol. It was within accepted standards. It was also, possibly, too early. If brain death was confirmed prematurely, if the sedation was still suppressing a cortical signal that existed, then every form signed, every review conducted, every hour of that 48-hour clock was built on a diagnosis that was technically defensible and potentially catastrophically wrong. He did not say any of this to Hyun-young. He said, "Get me a functional MRI slot, earliest available, and pull the sedative clearance timeline." Hyun-young did not say, "I told you so." She was too professional for that. But she held very still for a moment in the way that people hold still when they have been carrying something heavy, and someone has finally agreed to take one end. Dr. Minho turned to Ronki. He looked at Abiola, who looked back at him with the frank, appraising stare of a 2-year-old who has decided he is probably not dangerous. "This is not recovery," he said carefully. "I want to be precise about that. This is not a prognosis. This is a data point that requires further investigation before we can say anything definitive." He paused. "But it's not nothing." At 12:41 a.m., the withdrawal order was formally paused pending advanced neuroimaging. The 48-hour clock stopped. The withdrawal order was paused, not canceled. That distinction mattered. The ethics board granted a 24-hour extension pending functional imaging results. The clock had not stopped. It had been reset, and its new endpoint was not negotiable. Dr. Minho made this clear to Hyun-young in the corridor at 1 a.m., in the tone he used when he wanted something understood precisely. "If the fMRI shows no cortical response, we proceed. The extension is for due diligence, not for hope." Hyun-young said yes. She meant, "We will see." The lullaby was recorded that night on Hyun-young's phone, Ronki humming it softly, Abiola joining in with her partial, earnest pitch, and the audio file was transferred to a small speaker placed on the bedside table in room 714. It was played at intervals, 20 minutes on, 20 off, throughout the remainder of the night and into the following morning. Each time the melody played, the EAG trace responded. Not dramatically, not conclusively, but consistently. A low amplitude fluctuation that rose when the melody began and subsided in the silences. Dr. Minho reviewed the logs 3 times before the fMRI slot opened. He did not yet have a word for what he was looking at. He had a series of data points and an unwillingness to connect them before the imaging confirmed whether there was anything to connect. Across the city, in offices that had no formal name and no listed address, the news of the paused withdrawal had created a different kind of tension. Men who had been waiting on a confirmation that had not arrived were beginning to make contingency calculations. Shantou port contracts that required Byung-chul's authentication had been probed for alternative signatories. A meeting that had been postponed 3 times was convened and then immediately suspended when someone noted that acting on assumption was how empires created their own vulnerabilities. They waited. But the waiting had developed an edge it had not had the day before. Ronki was called into a meeting with hospital administration at 9 a.m. A patient experience coordinator and a compliance officer, both carefully neutral in their language, asked her to describe the events of the previous night. She described them accurately. When they asked about Abiola's presence in the building, she said, "The babysitter canceled. I had no other option." They noted this. They thanked her. They told her the situation was under review. Under review was the language of an institution deciding how much this was going to cost it and in which direction. Hyun-young had submitted a written account before the meeting began, unprompted, describing Ronka's conduct as calm, appropriate, and potentially clinically significant. She had used the words potentially clinically significant deliberately. They were harder to dismiss than kindness. At 4:17 p.m., the second day of the extension, the lullaby played again through the small speaker. Dr. Minho was in the room this time. He stood at the foot of the bed, watching the EEG trace rise in its familiar low arc, watching the heart rate variability shift in the pattern that had now repeated across 19 documented intervals. He was watching the trace when Hyun-young said, very quietly, "Look." He looked at Byung-chul's hand. The index finger. A movement. Small. A curl inward. Barely a centimeter. lasting less than 2 seconds. The lullaby continued playing. The finger was still. Dr. Minho did not move. He replayed what he had seen against every possible explanation. Spinal reflex, involuntary motor response, artifact of repositioning. None of them were satisfying. Dr. Minho did not move for a long moment after the finger stilled. He was running the calculations the way he always ran them, methodically, with deliberate resistance to the conclusion he felt pulling at the edges of his thinking. A single, involuntary motor response was not evidence. The literature was full of cases where families had seen what they wanted to see, where grieving people had interpreted spinal artifact as intention, where hope had been allowed to write its own case notes. He was not going to be that doctor. He leaned forward. He waited until the lullaby had run through one full cycle and the room was quiet. Then he placed his hand near Byung-chul's wrist, not touching, close, and said, in a voice calibrated to be heard without being loud, "If you can hear us, squeeze." Silence. 15 seconds. 20. Nothing. "Doctor." Minho straightened. He was about to say something careful and precise about the need to wait for imaging results when Hyun-young reached forward and pressed play on the speaker. The lullaby began, the descending notes, soft, the broken pitch of Abiola's voice layered beneath Ronke's. Dr. Minho looked at the hand, a pause. 4 seconds, 5. The index finger curled inward, clear, slow, deliberate, the curl of a hand that is working very hard against significant resistance to perform a movement it has decided to make. It held for 3 seconds, then relaxed. Hyun-young's hand went to her mouth. The machines remained steady. Green and blue, rise and fall. Indifferent to the fact that something had just changed. The mechanism is not miraculous, it is neurological. In cases where deep sedation has suppressed cortical signaling, a gradual drug clearance can allow preserved neural networks to begin reactivating, a process called cortical remobilization. Auditory stimulation, particularly melodic patterns encoded in emotional memory, can serve as activating input for these reawakening circuits. The brainstem, which governs voluntary motor initiation at its most fundamental level, may retain sufficient integrity to transmit intentional signals before higher cortical functions have fully reestablished. What looks like a miracle is, in fact, a brain finding its way back through the only pathway still open. Full reassessment was ordered within the hour. The fMRI results, when reviewed against the new clinical data, showed regions of activity that had not been visible or had not been present in the original scans. The word irreversible was removed from the chart and replaced not with recovery. Dr. Minho was precise about this with every member of the team, but with indeterminate prognosis, reassessment ongoing. It was not hope. It was the careful, disciplined withdrawal of certainty, which, in this room, was the same thing. 3 days later, at 7:22 a.m., with no one in the room but Hyun-young on routine monitoring rounds, the lullaby playing its interval cycle from the small bedside speaker, Byung-chul opened his eyes. Not fully. A slow, effortful parting of lids, pupils dragging toward the light with the reluctance of something that had been very far away and was not yet certain it had arrived. He did not speak. His face held no expression that could be named. He was present the way a person is present in the first seconds of consciousness after profound sleep, aware that something exists, and not yet able to say what. Recovery did not arrive like a door opening. It arrived like light coming under a door, in increments so small that each one was barely worth noting, until the accumulation of them became undeniable. Ventilator weaning took 11 days. The first successful unassisted breath was documented at 6:04 a.m. on a Thursday with the same clinical precision as every other milestone, time-stamped, charted, reviewed. Physical therapy began in the second week. Passive range of motion initially, a physiotherapist moving limbs that Byung-chul could not yet direct himself, training muscle memory that the brain would eventually need to reclaim. Cognitive assessment followed, response to commands, visual tracking, basic orientation. The results were inconsistent in the way that waking neurological systems are inconsistent, present one session, and slower the next, gradually accumulating into something that held. Speech rehabilitation was the longest thread. The structures were intact. The pathways needed rebuilding. He spoke for the first time in week 4, not spontaneously. In response to a direct question from the speech therapist who had asked him, for the 3rd day running, to say his own name. He said it, slowly, correctly. The speech therapist noted it without visible emotion, because visible emotion was not what the moment required, and wrote it in the chart with the same pen she used for everything else. A week later, Dr. Minho visited. He asked Byung-chul how he was feeling. He asked about pain, about clarity, about whether the confusion that had characterized the early recovery weeks had lifted. Byung-chul answered each question. His voice was still effortful, and still slower than the cadence of a man who had once run meetings on 3 continents by phone. Then, unprompted, he asked, "What was that song?" Dr. Minho explained what had happened. The cleaning staff, the baby. The lullaby played from a phone speaker on the bedside table. The EEG response. The finger. The decision to pause the withdrawal order. Byung-chul listened without interrupting. His face held the careful stillness of someone processing information that is arriving in a register they do not yet have the language for. He remembered, somewhere beneath the fog of the recovery weeks, a sound, not words, a descending pattern, familiar in the way that things are familiar before you know why, the familiarity of something that preceded memory itself. His mother, the 4th floor, the dark, her voice filling the space where light had been. He did not say any of this to Dr. Minho. He looked at the window for a moment. Then he asked if it would be possible to hear it again. Dr. Minho played the recording from Hyun-young's phone. Byung-chul closed his eyes. Neurological literature documents showed consistent patterns of value reorganization following significant brain injury. The mechanism is not fully understood, but is associated with altered connectivity between the prefrontal cortex, which governs executive function and abstract planning, and limbic structures governing emotional response. Survivors frequently report a reordering of priorities that does not feel chosen but felt. What had once seemed important is perceived, after injury, as distant. What had been suppressed, connection, sensation, the experience of being alive, becomes primary. He did not dissolve his operations from sudden sainthood. He did it from the particular clarity of a man who had been absent from his own life for a month and returned to find that its architecture no longer matched what he was willing to maintain. The violent threads were closed first. The financial structures were redirected across the following year, methodically, without announcement. A grant to a university neurology department was processed anonymously. A pediatric music therapy program received endowment funding through a charitable intermediary. Neither carried his name. A 3rd transfer, also anonymous, covered the outstanding balance of Abiola's speech therapy program in full and pre-funded the next 2 years of sessions. Ronki passed her U.S. nursing licensure examination on a Tuesday afternoon, and on 18 months after the night she had carried her daughter into a hospital in a yellow fleece blanket, she received the result by email, standing in the break room of the same hospital, in the same scrubs she had worn since the night shift. She read it twice, then she sat down. She did not cry. She had been too tired for too long for the relief to arrive all at once. It came in stages, the way the light had come back for Byung-chul, quietly, incrementally, and then undeniably. The protocol change took 14 months to ratify. It was not dramatic. It arrived the way institutional change usually arrives, through a working group, a draft document, a period of consultation, and a final revision that was distributed by internal memo on a Wednesday afternoon to the neurology department's shared inbox. The new standard required a mandatory sedative washout period before brain death confirmation could be considered complete, a window of time built into the protocol specifically to prevent the conditions that had very nearly resulted in Byung-chul's withdrawal. It did not mention his name. Protocols do not work that way. but the working group that drafted it included Dr. Minho, whose published paper on auditory stimulation in comatose patients, peer-reviewed, cited 14 times in its first year, and now had been the primary clinical evidence that made the change possible. The paper was careful, methodical, and explicit about its limitations. It made no claims it could not support. It simply documented what had happened in precise language and asked the field to consider what it meant. Yoon-young was now a senior nurse in the neurology unit. She had developed a habit, in her supervision of junior staff, of returning to one question whenever a case looked certain. What are we not yet testing for? It was not a question she announced as a philosophy. She simply asked it, routinely, as part of the work. The junior nurses who trained under her learned it without being taught it, the way you absorb the things that are demonstrated rather than stated. Ronki's caseload was full. She worked the morning shift now, neurology, appropriately, and she had the particular competence of someone who had earned their knowledge twice. Once in a classroom, and once in every room she had cleaned for 3 years, while the diploma sat in a folder in a drawer at home. She did not talk about the night in room 714 with her patients. She talked about their care. Abiola was 4. She sang clearly now. Full words, correct pitch, the lullaby reproduced with a precision her 2-year-old self had not been capable of. She sang it at home, in the car, unprompted, the way children sing things they love without knowing why they love them. The pediatric music therapy wing opened on a Thursday. The ceremony was modest, a ribbon, a small gathering of hospital staff and donors, children from the program singing in the atrium. The acoustics in the atrium were good. The sound carried. And Byung-chul stood at the back of the room. He had not been announced. He had asked not to be. He wore a coat that did not identify him as anything in particular, and he stood the way a man stands when he is somewhere he chose to be, rather than somewhere he was required to be. The children sang. He closed his eyes. The darkness, the machines, the sound arriving from somewhere he could not locate, descending, repeating, familiar in a way that had no name, a thread, thin, the only one that was still there. And something in him, something that had been very far away, had followed it back. The singing stopped. He opened his eyes. The atrium was ordinary again. Daylight, children, the murmur of adults in conversation. He left without speaking to anyone.